to the G20 and matters geopolitical. We're pleased to be joined again by our friend, Ambassador John Bolton, former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to the UN. Ambassador Bolton, thanks again for joining us. Appreciate it.
Well, good morning. Glad to be with you.
And so why don't we start with, before we get even to the G20, the news over the weekend that ISIS has been pushed out of Mosul, the celebration from the Iraqi government as to this success. What does that portend for the future of Iraq and for the future of ISIS in the region?
Well, they've been pushed out of most of Mosul. I mean, this is the longest-running attack on a city, and I think in the past 15 years in the conflict in the Middle East. They're still not completely gone. They will be, but it's more propaganda from the Iraqi regime about their so-called successes. It's sort of like the fall of Raqqa, the headquarters of ISIS in Syria. That's already been announced a couple of times too. Now, as I say, eventually it will happen, but you have to take all of this with a grain of salt. What it means in terms of Mosul specifically is that at some point the Baghdad government will get back territorial control over most of Iraq. That is not a good thing for the United States because the Baghdad government is essentially in thrall to the Ayatollahs in Tehran. This is the demonstration of what was wrong with the Obama strategy from the get-go. Because to defeat ISIS in Iraq, although the Kurds were a major element of that, Obama placed the heaviest reliance on the Baghdad government's troops and Shia militia that accompanied them. So really, we're just now going to set up the next battle in the region between the Iranian coalition, which includes obviously Iran, the Baghdad government, the Assad regime in Syria, the Hezbollah terrorists in Lebanon, all backed by Russia. Which is going to be on the wrong side of that conflict, and with which we have just announced a southwestern Syria ceasefire, a complete victory for Russia.
You had a similar take on the Syrian policy, the ceasefire, that really this is nothing to celebrate, that this is kind of an extension of the Obama administration's policies. And you also raised a point that I think Charles Krauthammer has as well, that Putin's a liar, and he'll lie to you with a smile. And we should be very disconcerted about that. Could you talk a little bit about those two issues?
Sure, and I thought the characteristics that Putin displayed in the one-on-one meeting with Trump in Hamburg, Germany on Friday really proved the point. Contrary to what some on the American left thought would happen, Trump went in, raised the issue of Russian interference in the American elections, came back to it repeatedly, according to Secretary of State Tillerson. They had a robust and lengthy discussion. The New York Times reported that as much as 40 minutes of the 2-hour-plus meeting was on the election issue. So at least Trump raised it vigorously. That was important. And what happened was Putin, to his face, flat out denied the Russian government was involved, which is completely contrary to substantial intelligence that the U.S. government has, and every member of Congress who's seen it on the Hill has come away with the conclusion that obviously Russia was very much involved in trying to affect the election. So it's not surprising that Putin lied. He's said previously the Russian government had nothing to do with it, but what's significant about this is that the President of the United States looked Putin in the eye and said, "You're interfering in our election. Stop it." And Putin looked right back at him and said, "No, I'm not." Now, to me, interference in America's elections is an existential threat to this country. We are a country founded on an idea of free people living together, choosing their own government. And interfering in that process, interfering in the Constitution, is worse philosophically and in the real world than attacking our ships or our planes or our bases. It's attacking what America is. And Putin just flat out lied about it. So, I think we need to do a lot of things to respond to the Russian hacking. We shouldn't take it lying down. But what it tells you about the character of the Russian government, today's Russian government, is incredibly important. Because if they're willing to lie about interfering in our election, they'll lie about anything. And they are. About Syria, about Iran's nuclear weapons program, about North Korea's nuclear weapons program, about what they're doing in Ukraine and Eastern and Central Europe. So we can negotiate with the Russians, but we need to do it with our eyes wide open.
So do you look at the dust up now with Donald Trump Jr., and as you're describing such a calculating regime, do you think that was a setup, and what do you think the implications of that will be?
I don't think we know at this point nearly what we need to know. I find it very hard to believe that Russia would send out some random lawyer in the middle of the campaign if their effort is as calibrated as people say it is. I think the campaign's response to a probe like that should have been "see my lawyer," and it should have been vetted that way. But if this is the best evidence they've got of Trump campaign collusion with Russia, we're well past time to call this whole thing off. If there were evidence of collusion, it would be extraordinarily serious.
Then how do you?
So far, there isn't any, and
right.
I don't think this amounts to it.
When how did you react when you heard Rex Tillerson's statements on the topic of the ceasefire and Russia working with Russia to institute that ceasefire, which you're suspicious of as you make your case? Tillerson essentially saying, we want the same things, meaning the U.S. and Russia, and so we're just kind of trying to work out a way to get to what we share in common, that we have more in common than that's what separates us. That seemed to me a bit of an odd statement to make with the autocratic regime you've just been describing.
Well, the worst part about it was that it sounded exactly like the Obama administration.
Yeah, right.
I'm focusing on Syria now. John Kerry and Barack Obama said for 4 years, we're working with the Russians. We all have the same long-term objective. We want to see Assad moved peacefully out of power, transition to a new regime. That was never the Russian objective. They played us on that. It's going on now 6 years since the beginning of the civil war in Syria. The Russians are not going to accept Assad being removed unless they get another stooge in power who will do what they want. They've got an important naval base at Tartus. They've established under Barack Obama a significant air base at Latakia. They've intruded into the Middle East in a way they haven't for nearly 50 years. These are unpleasant physical realities that it's the hand Trump was dealt. The trouble with this ceasefire agreement is that it legitimizes, it acquiesces in the Russian military presence. And besides that, it has every indication that gives Assad relief on this front in southwest Syria so that he can increase his efforts somewhere else. I mean, we'll see how long this lasts. The history of ceasefires in this Syrian conflict is pretty short, but I think by and large it was a victory for the Russians, nothing to be encouraged about.
As somebody who was a professional diplomat, a former U.S. ambassador to the UN, I'm just interested in your answer to this question, because a lot of the reporting on the G20 was the G19 plus one, Trump not with the rest of the world leaders when it comes to the Paris Accord, not with them on certainly immigration policy, to some extent trade policy. And so the go it alone, even though he's made speeches both in Saudi Arabia and Poland that say something quite different about his America First policy, America First approach. But the Pew Research came out with some new numbers on the confidence the rest of the world has in the U.S. president, the confidence the rest of the world has in American leadership. And they're down, both numbers are down substantially from where they were at the end of the Obama administration. Should we wear those bad numbers as badges of honor that suggests that America is leading if the rest of the world that we don't want to emulate isn't happy with us? Or is that a concern, our kind of public standing, the confidence the rest of the world has in America?
Yeah, well, I never pay any attention to these numbers. If you think people in the rest of the world are, every morning they get up, they read 7 or 8 newspapers, they think about the issues deeply, how are things going, how does the United States look, and then they come to a considered judgment after hours of considering the question.
Oh, come on.
It doesn't happen that way. So let them think whatever they want. The job of the American president is to defend American interest. And, sometimes that means taking an approach very different from your predecessor. And that's what Trump has done, certainly on pulling out of the Paris Accords. But it's the right thing to do from America's perspective. And if you're not a leader if you're following the other people. See how that goes?
Yeah,
the leader actually steps out in front In the George W. Bush administration, I've written my proudest day as a public servant was the day I unsigned the United States from the Rome Statute creating the International Criminal Court, which now has over 140 or 50 other members, and we pulled out of that. We had never ratified it, but we were even removed our signature from the treaty. That's real leadership.
All right. He is Ambassador John Bolton. Ambassador Bolton, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Glad to do it. Thanks for having me.
And he joined us on the turnkey.pro answer line.
Russians must